In 1999, two graduate students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin were running a small search engine out of a modest office, and they were willing to sell the whole thing for around $750,000. The company, on the other side of that potential deal, was Excite, at the time one of the most popular search portals on the internet, with real traffic, real revenue, and real leadership, making real business decisions. Excite's CEO, George Bell, passed on the deal. Reports from people involved at the time describe venture investor Vinod Khosla, who sat on Excite's board, pushing hard for the acquisition and even offering to help negotiate the price down further, closer to a lower figure, to make the deal easier to justify. Bell still declined. Within a few years, Google's search technology proved dramatically more relevant and useful to actual users than Excite's own approach, and the gap between the two companies only widened from there. Excite itself didn't survive much longer, swallowed into bankruptcy during the dot-com crash that hit the wider internet sector hard in the early 2000s. Google, meanwhile, grew into one of the most valuable companies on the planet, built directly on the search technology. Excite had the option to own outright for less than $1 million. To understand why Excite's leadership genuinely didn't see the gap at the time, it helps to understand what the two companies were actually competing to become. In 1999, most major internet companies, Excite, Lycos, Alta Vista, and Yahoo among them, weren't really trying to be the best search engine. They were racing to become the best portal, a single homepage users would set as their browser's default and never leave, combining email, news, weather, stock quotes, and search into one sticky bundle designed to maximize how long a user stayed on the page and how many ads they saw along the way. Inside that strategic framing, search itself was treated as one commodity feature among many, useful, expected, but not the actual product being sold to advertisers. Google's founders had the opposite thesis entirely, that search was the actual product, that a fast, uncluttered, single-purpose search page that got users their answer and let them leave immediately was more valuable, not less, than a sticky portal stuffed with content designed to keep them around. Google's underlying technology, later famous as PageRank, was born a year earlier, in 1998, out of a research project at Stanford University by Page and Brin, then PhD students, built around the insight that a web page's importance could be measured by treating links to it from other pages, roughly like citations in an academic paper, weighting links from already important pages more heavily than links from obscure ones. That approach was structurally different from the keyword matching techniques most portal search engines were using at the time, and it produced results that were noticeably, measurably better once enough of the web had been indexed. There's a well-known business theory that explains exactly the trap Excite fell into, developed by strategy scholars C.K. Prahalad and Gary Hamel, the idea of core competency, the notion that a company's lasting advantage comes from a small set of deeply developed internal capabilities, and that resources are best spent reinforcing those existing strengths rather than chasing capabilities outside the company's defined focus. Applied thoughtfully, that's genuinely sound strategic advice. Applied carelessly, it becomes a filter that quietly rejects anything that doesn't fit neatly inside what a company already believes its core competency to be. Excite's core competency, as leadership understood it at the time, was building a sticky portal, not running the world's best search engine. Evaluated against that self-definition, buying Google looked like an unnecessary distraction rather than the single most valuable acquisition opportunity in the company's history. Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen described a closely related pattern in his influential work on disruptive innovation, laid out in his book The Innovator's Dilemma. Christensen's core finding was that well-run, competent companies frequently fail not because they make bad decisions, but because they make entirely reasonable decisions by the standards of their existing business, decisions that are individually sound, but that collectively blind the company to a smaller, simpler, initially less profitable technology that eventually improves enough to overtake the incumbent's entire market. A new technology that looks unimpressive against an established product's current feature set is exactly the kind of threat Christensen's research warned about and Excite's evaluation of Google fits the pattern almost exactly. Google's search results were, in the earliest days, a simpler product in some respects. One page, one search box, none of the portal features Excite had spent years building out. Evaluated as a portal competitor, it looked unimpressive. Evaluated as a search technology on its own terms, it was already better, and getting better faster than Excite's own approach could keep pace with. This is worth naming plainly for any manager evaluating outside technology, a potential acquisition, or a competitor's new product today. An innovation that looks unimpressive relative to your existing feature set is not the same thing as an innovation that fails to solve the underlying problem well. Those are two entirely different questions, and conflating them is exactly the evaluation error that cost Excite the opportunity to own Google for less than $1 million. There's a closely related failure mode worth naming separately, because it explains why even a leadership team that did recognize a new technology's merit might still reject it. Cannibalization, fear, the reluctance to invest seriously in a new approach, specifically because it might compete with, or replace, revenue the company already earns from its existing product. Excite's leadership had built a real, profitable business around the portal model, a model that depended on keeping users on page as long as possible to show them more advertising. A search engine explicitly designed to answer a query and let the user leave immediately was, in a very direct sense, a threat to exactly the business model funding Excite's own operations. Even a leadership team that clearly saw Google's technical superiority might have hesitated to build their own strategy around a tool engineered to reduce the very page views their advertising revenue depended on. This is a distinct trap from simply failing to recognize quality. It's recognizing quality and still resisting it, because adopting it would require dismantling the thing that currently pays the bills. The practical takeaway generalizes cleanly to any manager evaluating a new tool, workflow, or technology that might compete with an existing internal system or revenue stream. Ask two separate questions, not one. First, does this new approach genuinely solve the underlying problem better? Second, and separately, would adopting it threaten a revenue stream, a team, or a process that currently justifies its own existence? Both questions deserve honest answers, but only the first one should determine whether the underlying technology gets taken seriously. The second question explains organizational resistance. It should never be allowed to quietly answer the first question by default. It's worth noting how small the actual numbers involved were, since that detail is easy to skip past. $750,000, even adjusted only modestly for the years since, was not a large sum for a company the size Excite had already grown into by 1999. This wasn't a case where the price tag itself created real financial risk that justified caution. The resistance came entirely from the evaluation framework, not from any genuine budget constraint, which makes the case even more useful as a teaching example. The mistake cost almost nothing to avoid, and the leadership team still walked past it, because the way the opportunity was framed internally made a genuinely cheap, genuinely available opportunity look unnecessary rather than obviously worth pursuing. A cheap, easily affordable opportunity being rejected on strategic grounds rather than financial ones is exactly the pattern worth watching for inside your own organization, since financial constraints are visible and get scrutinized, while a flawed evaluation framework quietly operates in the background, unexamined, until years later when the consequences are already impossible to reverse. There's a useful internal test worth running the next time a genuinely cheap opportunity gets dismissed inside your own team. Ask specifically whether the decision was actually about cost, or about how uncomfortably different the new approach looks from what the team already knows how to do. Discomfort with something unfamiliar very often disguises itself as a strategic objection, phrased in the language of priorities, focus, or fit, when the real driver underneath is simply that adopting the new approach would require admitting the existing approach isn't as good as everyone has grown comfortable believing it is. Separating a genuine cost objection from a disguised comfort objection, honestly and explicitly, is a small habit that would have been worth a great deal to Excite's leadership back in 1999, and it costs the organization nothing more than a moment of real, Genuinely uncomfortable honesty at exactly the meeting where the actual decision gets made, not in the retrospective that inevitably follows a mistake nobody wanted to name out loud in time. None of this makes Excite look like a badly managed company overall, and that's exactly the point worth remembering. Excite wasn't a careless or poorly run company by the standards of its time. It's precisely because a competent, reasonably successful leadership team made this exact mistake, evaluating a genuinely superior technology against their own existing product instead of against the underlying problem it was actually meant to solve, that the case remains worth studying decades later, long after the specific dollar figures and the specific companies involved have largely faded from most people's everyday memory. That's ultimately what makes this story more useful than a simple joke about a missed opportunity, more useful than the shorter, punchier version most people already know by heart without ever thinking through why it actually happened. Competence didn't prevent the mistake. A reasonable, defensible internal process, applied honestly to the wrong question, still produced a confidently wrong answer in the end, and confidently wrong is a far more dangerous place for a leadership team to sit than obviously uncertain, because confidence rarely invites a second look before the decision is already locked in for good. The specific question you choose to ask, more than the raw intelligence or diligence of the people asking it, is very often what actually decides whether a competent team walks straight past its own best opportunity, sitting right there on the table the entire time, priced at less than a rounding error on next quarter's budget. It's tempting to retell this story as a simple joke about a company that couldn't recognize genius when it was staring them directly in the face. That retelling is satisfying, but it skips past the actual, more useful mistake sitting underneath the story. The mistake wasn't underestimating an unknown startup in the abstract sense. Everyone underestimates unknown startups constantly, and for good statistical reason. Most startups fail. Most small ideas go nowhere. And any experienced business leader who takes every small pitch at face value would waste enormous resources chasing dead ends. Being skeptical of small, unproven ideas isn't the error here. The actual mistake was in how the evaluation itself was framed. Excite's leadership reportedly evaluated the acquisition largely by asking whether they already had something similar in their own existing product. Excite already ran its own search technology, and, from the inside, Google's underlying approach, an early version of ranking search results by analyzing the structure of links between pages, didn't look different enough on the surface to justify the price, or the operational disruption of integrating a small outside team into an already running product. That framing, do we already have something like this, is exactly the wrong question to ask about a genuinely novel piece of technology. The right question is considerably harder to ask honestly, and it's this: does the underlying approach solve the core problem meaningfully better than what we already have, regardless of whether it looks similar to our existing system from a distance? Google's search technology wasn't a cosmetic variation on existing search engines. Its core ranking approach was structurally different in a way that produced dramatically more relevant results, something that becomes obvious in hindsight, but was genuinely harder to see clearly from inside a company already committed to its own approach, evaluating a two-person team's very early product against an established, functioning system already generating real revenue. This pattern shows up constantly outside of Silicon Valley search engines, and it's worth naming directly because it's exactly the trap that catches experienced, competent leaders, not just careless ones. A small, unproven idea that solves a core problem in a genuinely better way deserves to be evaluated on its own merits, on whether the core approach is actually superior, not evaluated with an automatic discount because a comparable-looking feature already technically exists somewhere on your own product roadmap. The existence of something similar on paper says almost nothing about whether it's actually solving the underlying problem as well. There's a deeper trap buried inside this specific story worth naming plainly. Comparing a new idea against your own existing product, rather than against the actual problem the product is supposed to solve, quietly anchors every judgment in favor of whatever you've already built. Of course, Google's search engine didn't look dramatically necessary next to Excite's own search engine. From the perspective of someone whose job depended on believing Excite's existing search engine was already good enough. That's not a character flaw specific to George Bell. It's a structural blind spot built into evaluating outside ideas from inside an organization that already has a competing solution in production. The practical fix isn't complicated to describe, even if it's genuinely uncomfortable to practice consistently. Before dismissing a small, unproven idea as insufficiently different from what you already have, force the evaluation to start from the actual problem, not from your own existing product. Ask whether the new approach solves that underlying problem better on its own terms, as if your existing solution didn't already exist and wasn't sitting there quietly anchoring the comparison in its own favor. Excite had every reasonable, defensible reason at the time to believe its own search technology was good enough. That belief turned out to be catastrophically wrong, not because the belief itself was unreasonable given what Excite's leadership knew, but because the question being asked, "Do we already have this?" was structurally incapable of ever producing the right answer about a technology that solved the same problem in a fundamentally different, better way. The next time a small, unproven idea crosses your desk and your first instinct is that you already have something similar, treat that instinct itself as the thing worth double-checking, not the final word on the matter. Before dismissing a small, unproven idea as not different enough from what you already have, ask whether its core approach actually solves the problem better on its own terms, independent of anything you've already built or already believe about your own product, and independent of how small, cheap, or genuinely unimpressive the price tag on it happens to make it feel next to everything else already sitting on your desk this week. Follow along for more of these.